Hello, everyone. And by everyone, I do mean the one. As per astoundingly popular request by one individual, I will be reading 1776 by David Michelow whilst squatting, because I gotta hit my fitness bar, whatever. All right, so how this is gonna go, I'm gonna read until I hit the next chapter or my legs give out. So yeah, this is gonna be real fun. Real fun. Here we go. Chapter 1.
Nope.
On the afternoon of Thursday, October 26th, 1775, His Royal Majesty George III, King of England, rode in royal splendor from St. James's Palace to the Palace of Westminster, there to address the opening of Parliament on the increasingly distressing issue of war in America. The day was cool, but clear skies and sunshine, a rarity in London, brightened everything, and the royal cavalcade, spruced and polished, shone to perfection. In an age that had given England such rousing patriotic songs as "God Save the King" and "Rule Britannia," in a nation that adored ritual and gorgeous pageantry, it was a scene hardly to be improved upon. An estimated 60,000 people had turned out. They lined the whole route through St. James's Park. At Westminster, people were packed solid, many having stood since morning, hoping for a glimpse of the King or some of the notables of Parliament. So great was the crush that latecomers had difficulty seeing much of anything. One of the many Americans then in London, a Massachusetts loyalist named Samuel Curwen, found the mob outside the door to the House of Lords too much to bear and returned to his lodgings. It was his second failed attempt to see the King. The time before, His Majesty had been passing by in a sedan chair near St. James's, but reading a newspaper so close to his face that only one hand was showing. "The whitest hand my eyes have ever beheld, with a very large rose diamond ring," Loyalist Curwen recorded. The King's procession departed St. James's at 2 o'clock, proceeding at walking speed. By tradition, 2 horse grenadiers with swords drawn rode in the lead to clear the way, followed by gleaming coaches filled with nobility. Then a clattering of horse guards, the yeomen of the guard in red and gold livery, and a rank of footmen also in red and gold. Finally came the King in his colossal golden chariot, pulled by 8 magnificent cream-colored horses. These were Hanoverian creams, in a single position riding the left lead horse, and 6 footmen at the side. No mortal on earth rode in such style as their King. The English knew. 24 feet in length and 13 feet high, the royal coach weighed nearly 4 tons, even enough to make the ground tremble with underway. George III had had it built years before, insisting that it be superb. 3 gilded cherubs on top, symbols of England, Scotland, and Ireland, held high a gilded crown, while covering the heavy spoked wheels front and back, loomed 4 gilded sea guards, formidable reminders that Britannia ruled the waves. Dear God. Allegorical scenes on the door panels celebrated the nation's heritage, and windows were of sufficient size to provide a full view of the crowned sovereign within. It was as though the very grandeur, wealth, and weight of the British Empire was rolling past. An empire that by now included Canada, that reached from the seaboard of Massachusetts and Virginia to the Mississippi and beyond, from the Caribbean to the shores of Bengal. London, its population at nearly 1 million souls, was the largest city in Europe and widely considered the capital of the world. George III had been 22 when in 1760 he succeeded to the throne. And to a remarkable degree, he remained a man of simple tastes and few pretensions. He liked plain food and drank but little and wine only. Defying fashion, he refused to wear a wig. That the palace at St. James's had become a bit dowdy bothered him not at all. He rather liked it that way. Socially awkward at court occasions, many found him disappointingly dull. He preferred puttering about his farms at Windsor, dressed in farm's clothes, and in notable contrast to much of fashionable society and the court, where mistresses and infidelities were not only an accepted part of life, but often flaunted. The king remained steadfastly faithful to his very plain queen. It's kind of rude in its straightforwardness. Anyway, the German Princess Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, with whom by now he had produced 10 children. Ultimately, there would be 15. Gossips claimed Farmer George's chief pleasures were a leg of mutton and his plain little wife. But this was hardly fair. Nor was he the unattractive, dim-witted man critics claimed that then and afterward. Tall and rather handsome, with clear blue eyes and a generally cheerful expression, George III had a genuine love of music and played both the violin and piano. His favorite composer was Handel, but he adored also the music of Bach, and in 1764 had taken tremendous delight in hearing the boy Mozart perform on the organ. He loved architecture and did quite beautiful architectural drawings of his own. With a good eye for art, he had begun early to assemble his own collection, which by now included works by the contemporary Italian painter Canaletto, as well as watercolors and drawings by such old masters as Poussin and Raphael. He avidly collected books to the point where he had assembled one of the finest libraries in the world. He adored clocks, ship models, took great interest in things practical, took great interest in astronomy, and founded the Royal Academy of Arts. He also had a gift for putting people at their ease. Samuel Johnson, the era's reigning arbiter of all things of the mind, and so easy judge of men, responded warmly to the unaffected good nature of George III. They had met and conversed by the first time when Johnson visited the King's Library, after which Johnson remarked to the librarian, "Sir, they may talk of the King as they will, but he is the finest gentleman I've ever seen." Stories that he had been slow to learn, that by age 11 he still could not read, were unfounded. The strange behavior, the so-called madness of King George III, for which he would be long remembered, did not come until much later, more than 20 years later, and rather than mental illness, it appears to have been porphyria, a hereditary disease not diagnosed until the 20th century. Still youthful at 37, and still hard-working after 15 years on the throne, he could be notably willful and often short-sighted, but he was sincerely patriotic and everlastingly duty-bound. "George, be a king," his mother had told him. As the crisis in America grew worse, and the opposition in Parliament more strident, he saw clearly that he must play the part of the patriotic king. He had never been a soldier. He had never been to America, any more than he had set foot in Scotland or Ireland. But with absolute certainty, he knew what must be done.
he would trust to Providence and his high sense of duty. America must be made to obey. I have no doubt that the nation at large sees the conduct in America in its true light,
he had written to his Prime Minister, Lord North.
And I am certain any other conduct but compelling obedience would be ruinous. And therefore, no consideration could bring me to swerve from the present path which I think myself in duty bound to follow.
In the House of Lords in March of 1775, when challenged on the chances of Britain ever winning a war in America,
Lord Sandwich,
First Lord of the Admiralty, had looked incredulous.
Suppose the colonies do abound in men. What does that signify?
He asked.
They are raw, undisciplined, cowardly men.
And Lord Sandwich was by no means alone in that opinion. General James Grant, a member of the House of Commons, had boasted that with 5,000 British regulars, he could march from one end of the American continent to the other, a claim that was widely quoted. But in striking contrast, several of the most powerful speakers in Parliament, like the flamboyant Lord Mayor of London, John Wilkes, and the leading Whig intellectual Edmund Burke, had voiced ardent support for and admiration of the Americans. On March 22nd in the House of Commons, Burke had delivered in his heavy Irish brogue one of the longest, most brilliant speeches of his career, calling for conciliation with America. Yet for all that, no one in either House, Tory or Whig, denied the supremacy of Parliament in determining what was best for America. How many... Dear God. My legs are stronger than I thought. Crap. I've got over 10 more pages. Even Edmund Burke in his celebrated speech had referred repeatedly to our colonies. Convinced that his army at Boston was insufficient, the king had dispatched reinforcements, and three of his best major generals, William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. Howe, a member of Parliament and a Whig, had earlier told his Nottingham constituents that if it came to war in America, and he were offered a command, he would decline. But now duty called.
I was ordered, and could not refuse, without incurring the odious name of backwardness,
to serve my country in distress, he exclaimed. Howe, who had served in America during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America, was convinced the insurgents were few in number in comparison to those loyal to the crown. War had come to on April 19th, with the first blood shed at Lexington and Concord near Boston. Then, savagely, on June 17th at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, that's the June engagement, was commonly known as the Battle of Bunker Hill on both sides of the Atlantic, British troops remained under siege at Boston and were running short of food and supplies. On July 3rd, General George Washington of Virginia had taken command of the American rabble. With 3,000 miles of ocean separating British from her American colonies, accounts of such events took a month or more to reach London. By the time the first news of Lexington and Concord arrived, it was the end of May, and Parliament had begun its long summer holiday, its members departing London for their country estates. When the outcome to Bunker Hill became known in the last week of July, it only hardened the king's resolve.
We must persist, he told Lord North. I know I'm doing my duty, and therefore can never wish to retract.
The ever-obliging North suggested that in view of the situation in America, it might no longer be regarded as a rebellion, but as a foreign war, and thus every expedient might be employed. At a hurried meeting at 10 Downing Street on July 26th, the cabinet decided to send 2,000 reinforcements to Boston without delay, and to have an army of no fewer than 20,000 regulars in America by the following spring. I don't know, I might actually be able to do it. Anyway, Bunker Hill was proclaimed a British victory, which technically it was. But in plain truth, His Majesty's forces, led by General Howe, had suffered more than 1,000 casualties in an appalling slaughter before gaining the high ground. As was observed acidly in both London and Boston, a few more such victories would surely spell ruin for the victors. At summer's end, a British ship out of Boston docked at Plymouth, bearing 170 sick and wounded officers and soldiers, most of whom had fought at Bunker Hill, and all in great distress, as described in a vivid published account. A few of the men came on shore, whenever hardly were seen such objects, some without legs, and others without arms, and their clothes hanging on them like a loose morning gown. So much were they fallen away by sickness and want of nourishment. There were, moreover, near 60 women and children on board, the widows and children of men who were slain. Widows, that is. Some of these, too, exhibit a most shocking spectacle. And even the vessel itself, though very large, was almost intolerable from the stench arising from the sick and wounded. The miseries of the troops still besieged at Boston, and of those American loyal to the king who, fearing of their lives, had abandoned everything to find refuge in the town, were also described in letters published in the London papers, or in correspondence to friends and relatives in London. In the General Evening Post, one soldier portrayed the scene in Boston as nothing but melancholy, disease, and death. Another, who's appeared in the Morning Chronicle and Advisor, described being almost lost for want of fresh provisions. We are entirely blocked up, and the birds, like birds in a cage. John Singleton Copley, the American portrait painter who had left Boston to live in London the year before, read in a letter from his half-brother Henry Pelham. Goodness gracious. It is inconceivable the distress and ruin the unnatural dispute has caused to this town and its inhabitants. Almost every shop and store is shut. No business of any kind going on. I am of the multitude rendered very unhappy. The little I collect entirely lost. The clothes upon my back and a few dollars in my pocket are now the only property which I have. Despite the war, more likely because of it, the king remained popular in country at large and could count on a loyal following in Parliament. Political philosophy, patriotism, and a sense of duty comparable to the king's own figured strongly in both houses. So, too, did the immense patronage and public money that were his alone to dispense. And if that were not sufficient, there was the outright bribery that had become standard in a blatantly mercenary system not of his making, but that he readily employed to get his way. It's all of it. Indeed, bribery, favoritism, and corruption in a great variety of forms were rampant not only in politics, but at the levels of society. The clergy and such celebrated observers of the era as Jonathan Swift and Tobias Smollett had long since made it a favorite subject. London, said Smollett, was the devil's drawing room. Samuel Curwen,
The Salem loyalists saw dissipation and vicious indulgence everywhere he looked. From the lowest haunts to the most elegant and expensive rendezvous of the noble and polished world. Feeling a touch of homesickness, Curwen thanked God this was still not so back in New England. Too much of the press and the opposition in Parliament, the American war and its handling could not have been more misguided. The Evening Post, the most partisan in its denunciations, called the war unnatural, unconstitutional, unnecessary, unjust, dangerous, hazardous, and unprofitable. The St. James's Chronicle wrote contemptuously of a foolish, obstinate, and unrelenting king. The Crisis, a vehement new paper, attacked all the gaudy trappings of royalty and the villainy of the king.
What in God's name are you all about in England? Have you forgot us?
Asked a British officer in a letter from Boston published in London's Morning Chronicle. He wished that all the violent people who favored more vigorous measures in America could be sent over to see for themselves. Their vigor would be quickly cooled.
God send us peace and a good fireside in old England.
Oh, Maker preserve me. How many pages is this? Where am I? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages. I'm gonna slip. I'm drenched. I have strength to spare. So I gotta mop up this mess I'm making. Slip and crack myself open like an egg. Okay. It's in the mind, man. This is a mind game now. The king, meanwhile, had recalled General Thomas Gage, his commander-in-chief at Boston, and in his place put the stout-hearted William Hoe, when, in September, an emissary from the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, Richard Penn, arrived in London with an olive branch petition. In hand, that is, expressing loyalty to the crown and requesting, in effect, that the king find a way to reconciliation. George III refused to have anything to do with it. Behind the scenes, Lord North had quietly begun negotiations with several German princes of Hesse and Brunswick to hire mercenary troops. And in a confidential note dated October 15th, the king reassured the prime minister that every means of distressing America would meet his approval. By the crisp, sunny afternoon of October 26th, as George III proceeded on his way to the opening of Parliament, his popularity had never seemed higher. Opposition to the war, as everyone knew, was stronger and more vociferous in London than anywhere in the country. Yet here were crowds greater than any since ascension to the throne. Further, they appeared to be the best of spirits, as even the London Public Advertiser took note. Their looks spoke peace and good humor. There was but little hissing. The king could feel secure in the affection of the people.
Hey, maybe I spoke too soon.
The boom of cannon saluted His Majesty's arrival at Westminster, and with the traditional welcoming formalities performed, the king assumed his place on the throne at the head of the House of Lords, flanked by peers in their crimson robes. The members of the House of Commons, for whom no seats were provided, remained standing at the rear. The magnitude of the moment was lost on no one. As expected, the king's address would be one of the most important ever delivered by an English monarch. He had a good voice that carried well.
The present situation of America, and my constant desire to have your advice, concurrence,
and assistance on every important occasion have determined me to call you thus early together.
America was in open revolt, he declared, and he denounced as traitors to those to whom, by gross misrepresentation, labored to inflame his people in America. There was a desperate conspiracy. All the time they had been professing loyalty to the parent state, and the strongest protestations of loyalty to me. They were preparing for rebellion.
They have raised troops. That's not the right accent. And are collecting a naval force. They have seized the public revenue and assumed to themselves legislative, executive, and judicial powers, which they already exercise in the most arbitrary manner. And although many of these unhappy people may still retain their loyalty, the torrent of violence has been strong enough to compel their acquiescence till a sufficient force shall appear to support them. Acquiescence. That is the word.
Like the Parliament, he had acted thus far in a spirit of moderation, he said, and was anxious to prevent, if it had been possible, the effusion of the blood of my subjects and the calamities which are inseparable from a state of war. He hoped his people in America would see the light and recognize that to be a subject of Great Britain, with all of its consequences, is to be the freest member of any civil society to the known world. Then came a new charge. Based on opinions received from his commander at Boston, there must be no more misconceptions about the true intent of those deceiving the unhappy people of America.
The rebellious war is manifestly carried on far for the purpose of the establishing an independent empire. Goddamn. Read that again. The rebellious war is manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire. I need not dwell upon the fatal effects of the success of such a plan. The object is too important, the spirit of the British nation too high, the resources with which God hath blessed her too numerous to give up so many colonies, which she has planted with great industry, nursed with great tenderness, encouraged with many commercial advantages, and protected and defended at much expense of blood and treasure.
Since clearly it was the better part of wisdom to put a speedy end to such disorders, he was increasing both his naval and land forces. Further, he was pleased to inform the Parliament he had received friendly offers of foreign assistance.
When the unhappy and deluded multitude against whom this force will be directed shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the missile with tenderness and mercy,
he pledged. And as evidence of the good intentions, he would give authority to certain persons to grant pardons upon the spot in America, though beyond that he said no more. In sum, he, George III, sovereign of the empire, had declared America in rebellion. He had confirmed that he was committing land and sea forces, as well as unnamed foreign mercenaries, sufficient to put an end to that rebellion. And he had announced the leaders of the uprising for having American independence as their true objective, something those leaders themselves had not yet openly declared.
Among the many unavoidable ill consequences of the rebellion, he said at the last, none affects me more sensibly than the extraordinary burden with which it must create to my faithful subjects.
His Majesty's appearance before Parliament had lasted just 20 minutes, after which, as reported, he returned to St. James's Palace as peacefully as he went.
Yo. Guys, I'm gonna keep it a buck. I'm gonna keep it a buck. I don't wanna do this no more. I'm gonna keep it 100. You know, like, Ah, God. Ah. Am I a man of my word? Of strength? I don't want to be. I want it to end. Ah, God.
The members of the House of Commons filed out directly to their own chamber, and debate on the King's address commenced. Brisk and warm in both houses, the opposition marshalled the case for conciliation with extraordinary force. In the House of Lords, expression of support were spirited through comparatively brief. The King was praised for his resolution to uphold the interests and honor of the kingdom, praised for his decisiveness.
We will support your majesty with our lives and fortunes,
Vowed Viscount Townsend. Those in opposition had more to say, and spoke at times with pronounced emotion. The measures recommended from the throne warned the Marquis of Rockingham were big with the most pretentious and ruinous consequences. The hiring of foreign troops was an alarming and dangerous expedient. Even more deplorable was the prospect of shedding British blood by British hands. A notion of conquering America was wild and extravagant, and the Earl of Coventry. The administration was no longer to be trusted, said Lord Lyttelton bitterly.
How comes it that the colonies are charged with planning independency?
The Earl of Shelburne demanded to know.
What is it that presumes to put an assertion, what shall I call it, my lords, contrary to fact, contrary to evidence? It is their intention, by thus perpetually sounding independence in the ears of the Americans, to lead them to it.
As the afternoon light began to fade and the chamber grew dim, the candles of the chandeliers were lit. The one surprise, as the debate continued, was a vehement speech by the Duke of Grafton, Augustus Henry Fitzroy, former Prime Minister, and who had not previously opposed the administration. Until now, he said, he had concurred in the belief that the more forceful the government in dealing with the Americans, the more likely matters could be amicably adjusted. But he had been misled, deceived, admitting to his ignorance of the real state of things in America, and inferring that this was no uncommon handicap in Parliament. He boldly proposed the appeal of every act concerning America since the Incendiary Stamp Act of 1765.
What's he sound like?
This, I will venture to assert, will answer every end, and nothing less will accomplish my effectual purpose. Without scenes of ruin and destruction, which I cannot think on without the utmost grief and horror.
The Earl of Dartmouth, Secretary of State for the Colonies, was astonished. How could any noble lord possibly condemn the policies of the administration, or withdraw support without at least giving them a fair trial? It was in the Commons that the longer, more turbulent conflict ensued. Of the 20 or so who rose to speak, few held back. Attacks on the King, Lord North, the Foreign Ministry in general, that is, and on one another times brought the heat of debate to a boiling point.
Bear with me. We're almost there.
Were insults exchanged that would long fester. Bombast and hyperbole in abundance, in moments when eloquence was brought to bear with a dramatic effect remarkable even in the Commons. It was Parliament as theatre, and gripping even if the outcome, like much of theatre, was understood all along. For importantly, it was also well understood and deeply felt that the historic chamber was again the setting for history, that issues of the utmost consequence, truly the fate of nations, were at stake. The passion of opposing opinion was evident at once, as the youthful John Dyke Ackland of Devonshire declared emphatic support of the king's address. True, it was the task of reducing America to a just obedience should not be underestimated, he said, but where the interests of the great people were concerned, difficulties must be overcome, yet not yielded to.
Man, I'm getting real sloppy now. Good Lord. But why would I stop when I'm so close?
Ackland, a headstrong young army officer, was ready to serve in America and himself, and would, and thus, what he said had unusual force, if not perfect history validity.
Recollect the strength, the resources, and above all, the spirit of the British nation,
which, when roused, knows no opposition. Which, when roused, knows no opposition.
Let me remind you of those extensive and successful wars that this country has carried on before the continent of America was known. Let me turn your attention to that period when you defended this very people from the attacks of the most powerful and valiant nation in Europe, France, when your armies gave law and your fleets rode triumphant on every coast. Shall we be told then that this people, the Americans, whose greatness is the work of our hands, and whose insolence arises from our divisions, who have mistaken the lenity of this country for its weakness, and the reluctance to punish for a want of power to vindicate the violated rights of British subjects? Shall we be told that such a people can resist the powerful efforts of this nation? Good Lord. God,
At about the time the chandeliers were being lighted in the house, John Wilkes, Lord of London, champion of the people, and the homeliest man in Parliament, stood to be heard, and to let there be no doubt that he was John Wilkes.
London. Let's give another accent.
I speak, sir, as the firm friend to England and America, but still more to universal liberty and the rights of all mankind. I trust no part of the subjects of this vast empire will ever submit to be slaves. Never had an England been engaged in the contest of such support to their own best interests and possessions, Wilkes said.
Okay.
We are fighting for the subjection, the unconditional submission of a country infinitely more extended than our own, of which every day increases the wealth, the natural strength, the population. Should we not succeed, we shall be considered as their most implacable enemies. An eternal separation will follow, and the grandeur of the British Empire pass away. The war with our brethren in America was unjust, fatal, and ruinous to our country, he declared. There was no longer any question whether the Americans would fight, conceded Tory Adam Ferguson, but could anyone doubt the strength of Great Britain to reduce them? And this, he said, must be done quickly and decisively, as an act of humanity. Half measures would not do. Half measures could lead only to the horrors of civil war. In response, John Stone, a dashing figure who had once served as governor of West Florida, delivered one of the longest, most vehement declamations of the night, exclaiming,
"Every Machiavellian policy is now to be vindicated towards the people of America. Men are to be brought to this black business hoodwinked. They are to be drawn in by degrees until they cannot retreat. We are breaking through all those sacred maxims of our forefathers, and giving alarm to every wise man on the continent of America, that all his rights depend on the will of men whose corruptions are notorious, who regard him as an enemy, and who have no interest in prosperity." John Stone praised the people of New England for their courage and fortitude.
There was a wide difference, he said, between the English officers, a soldier who merely did his duty, and those of the New England Army, where every man was thinking of what further service he could. Turn the page. He could perform. No one loves the glorious freedom. No one who loved the glorious freedom of spirit of freedom could not be moved by the spectacle of Bunker Hill, where, in a regular peasantry had so bravely faced the gallant Howe, leading the finest troops in the world. Who was there that dismiss all doubts on the justice of a cause which can inspire such conscious rectitude? Alexander Weddenberg, the Solicitor General, belittled the very idea of standing in the way of the king and called for the full-scale conquest of America. Why then do we hesitate? He asked.
Because an inconsiderable party, inconsistent in their own policies and always hostile to all government but their own, endeavor to obstruct our measures and clog the wheels of government. Let us rather second the indignant voice of the nation, which presses in from all quarters upon the sovereign, calling loudly for vigorous measures. Sir, we have been too long deaf. We have too long shown our forbearance and long suffering. Our thunders must go forth. America must be conquered.
As the night wore on, Lord North, the stout, round-shouldered Prime Minister, remained conspicuously silent in his front bench seat, his large, near-sighted eyes and full cheeks giving him the look as, my word, the wit Horace Walpole said of a blind trumpeter. North was much liked, moderate, urbane, and intelligent. He had made his career in the Commons, and with his affable manner, had acquired few, if any, enemies among his political opponents. When attacked, he took no offense. He could be a remarkably persuasive speaker, but was equally capable, when need be, of remaining silent, even napping a bit. From years of experience, North had also learned to count votes in advance, and he knew now, as did nearly everyone present, that the decided majority of the Commons, like the people at large, stood behind the king. Perhaps the most telling moment of the whole heated session came near midnight, when another army officer, but of an older generation than John Dyke Ackland, rose to speak. Colonel Isaac Bear. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War, who had come home from the Battle of Quebec badly disfigured. He had been hit in the head by a musket ball that blinded him in one eye and left his face twisted in a permanent sneer. Further, it had been Isaac Bear, in a past speech in defense of the Americans, who had first called them Sons of Liberty, and the name had taken hold. He had lost one eye, the colonel reminded his listeners, but the one good military eye he had left did not deceive him. The only way to avert this American storm was to reach an accommodation just as soon as possible.
Goddamn.
Between them, God, I'm feeling my knees, dude.
Form check.
Surprisingly, I think I can do it. Oh, it's in the. It's like my knees.
But no, it's all right. Oh, we're getting there though. Oh man.
All right. Between them, Edmund Burke and young Charles James hold on. So I had to make sure I was still recording. Anyway, between them, Edmund Burke and young Charles James Fox filled the next several hours. Burke, in customary fashion, took his time. Nearly all that he said, he and others had said before. But he saw no harm in repetition. or any need for hurry. He held the floor for nearly 2 hours, a large part of the speech devoted to the disgrace of British forces cooped up in Boston by those said to be an undisciplined rabble. There was no ringing lines from Burke this time, little at all for the newspapers to quote. Possibly he did not wish to outshine Fox, his protege, who spoke next and who at 26 was already a dazzling political star. Born to wealth and position, Fox was an unabashed fop, a dandified macaroni, who at times appeared in high-heeled shoes, each of a different color, and happily spent most nights drinking or gambling away his father's fortune at London's best clubs. But his intelligent and oratorical gifts were second to none. He always spoke spontaneously, never from notes or prepared text. Fox, it would be observed, would as soon write down what he was going to say as pay a bill before it came due. He attacked immediately and in searing fashion, calling Lord North the blundering pilot who had brought this nation to a terrible impasse. If Edmund Burke had failed to provide a memorable line for the night's efforts, Fox did at once.
Lord
Catham, the King of Prussia, nay. Lord Catham, the King of Prussia, nay, Alexander the Great, never gained more in one campaign than the noble lord has lost, and he has lost a whole continent.
He's starting to get high from all this squatting.
It was time for a change in the administration. Time for new policies. The present ministers were enemies of freedom. I cannot consent to the bloody consequences of so silly a conquest about so silly an object. Conduct in the silliest manner that history or observation has ever furnished an instance of, and from which we are likely to derive nothing but poverty, disgrace, defeat, and ruin. Once Fox finished, North stood at his place and calmly he had no wish to remain a day in office were he to be judged inactive, inattentive, or inconsiderate. North was not a man enamored with war. He had nothing of the look or temperament of a war leader. Privately, he was not at all sure it would be possible to vanquish the Americans, and he worried about the cost. To General Burgoyne he had written, I abandon the contest were I not most intimately convinced in my own conscience that our cause is just and important. George III relied on him, calling him my sheet anchor, and it was and would remain North's role to explain and defend the king and administration policies and decisions before the Commons. The intention now, he affirmed, was to send a powerful sea and land force across the Atlantic. But with these forces would also go offers of mercy upon a proper submission. How proper submission was to be determined, or who was to bear such offers, he did not say. As time would show, however, the real purpose of each peace gestures was to speed up an American surrender.
This will show we are in earnest, that we are prepared to punish, but are nevertheless ready to forgive. This is, in my opinion, the most likely means of producing an honorable reconciliation.
On that note, the debate ended, and the House of Lords, where work had wound up at midnight, the opposition to the King's address, and thus to all-out war in America, was defeated by a vote of more than 2-1, 69 to 29. And the House of Commons, their impassioned speeches notwithstanding, the opposition was defeated by an even greater margin, 278 to 108. By the time the vote in the Commons had concluded, it was 4 in the morning. One of those members of the House of Commons who had refrained from speaking and who felt extremely pleased with the outcome was the gentleman scholar Edward Gibbon. A supporter of Lord North, Gibbon never spoke on any issue, but in private correspondence from his London home, he had been assuring friends that something will be done. Something will be done about America. The power of the empire would be exerted to the utmost, he wrote. Irish Papists, Hanoverians, Canadians, Indians, etc. will all in various shapes be employed. Gibbon, who was then putting the final touches to the first volumes of his masterpiece, History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, now felt even more confident about the course of history in his own time. The conquest of America is a great work, he wrote. Soon after, in early November, King George III appointed a new secretary for the American colonies, Lord George Germain, a choice that left little doubt, if any remained, that the king too considered the conquest of America serious work, to which he was seriously committed. Germain was to replace the Earl of Dartmouth, whose attitude toward the war seemed at times less than wholehearted. He was a proud, intelligent, exceedingly serious man of 60, tall, physically impressive, and, notably unlike the king and Lord North, he was a soldier. He had served in the 7 Years' War in Germany, and with good reputation, until the Battle of Minden, when, during a cavalry attack, he was accused of being slow to obey orders. He was not charged with cowardice, as his critics like to say. At a court-martialed call at his own inconsistence, he was found guilty only of disobedience. But his military career ended when the court declared him unfit for further service. As a politician in the years since, he had performed diligently, earning a high reputation as an administrator. In his new role, he would direct the main operation of the war and was expected to take a firm hand. To many, he seemed the perfect counterpart to the obliging, unassertive North. For the riotous rebels of America, he had no sympathy. What was needed, Germain said, was a decisive blow. The king thought highly of him.
That's an interesting end. There. One old chapter. You know, it's something what you can do when you're, I guess, distracted. You know, I got a little bit of an ache, but I'm not destroyed yet. I could do more. That's not bad for, over 50 minutes of consistent squats? Good squats, by the way. You gotta take my word for it. I was going down, but I will say that the left side, the knee a little bit, it's a little stiff. But man, all right, there you go. Hope you enjoyed. Will I do this again? This was excruciating. So maybe. Anyway, see you next time.